Right now, while you're reading this, your house is spending money. Not because anyone's cooking, not because a TV is playing, not because a single light is switched on, but because dozens of devices sitting perfectly off are still quietly sipping electricity. All day, every day, all year long. It has a name, idle load, or what most people call phantom power. And according to one of the largest home energy studies ever conducted, it's eating up close to a quarter of what a typical household spends on electricity. The fix costs nothing. It takes about 20 minutes, and it involves a piece of technology so old and unglamorous that almost nobody thinks to credit it as a solution. A simple switch. Here's the part that makes this frustrating. This isn't some fringe theory. It's been measured, published, and confirmed by government labs and independent researchers for nearly 3 decades. Yet almost nobody outside the energy research world has ever heard the term idle load. Your monthly electricity bill breaks down peak usage, maybe compares you to your neighbors, maybe nudges you toward a smart thermostat, but it will never once tell you that a meaningful chunk of that bill is going toward devices doing absolutely nothing useful. That gap between what's been proven and what actually reaches ordinary people is where this story lives. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to 1955, to a Zenith Radio Corporation engineer named Eugene Pauly. Pauly built something called the Flashmatic, the world's first wireless TV remote. It looked like a toy ray gun, and it worked by shooting a beam of visible light at photoelectric sensors mounted on the corners of the television screen. Point, click, and the channel changed without anyone leaving the couch. Audiences loved it. What almost nobody realized at the time was that this convenience came with a quiet, permanent cost. For a television to respond instantly to a beam of light, or later an infrared signal, some part of it has to stay awake and listening, even when the screen is black. That principle, a device staying partially alert so it can respond instantly, became the invisible architecture behind nearly every electronic product built afterward. Remotes spread from TVs to VCRs in the 80s, then to cable boxes, stereos, and eventually almost everything with a power button. Each new, always-ready feature meant one more device that never fully switched off. By the mid-1990s, researchers started taking this seriously. A scientist named Alan Myers, working at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, led some of the earliest formal measurements of what his team called leaking electricity, power drawn by household devices that weren't performing their main function. The early numbers were modest on their own. A TV in standby might pull a few watts, a VCR clock a bit more, a cable box more still. But multiply small numbers by dozens of devices running continuously, and you get a load that never sleeps. Myers' 1997 report estimated standby power made up roughly 5% of household electricity use in the U.S. That number didn't stay put. It kept climbing as homes filled with more digital devices, and by the early 2010s, some estimates put idle consumption closer to 20%. Then, in 2015, the Natural Resources Defense Council released the most detailed study of its kind. Working with Stanford's Sustainable Systems Lab, researchers analyzed smart meter data from 70,000 homes across Northern California and paired it with hands-on audits of 10 sample households. What they found was staggering. The average home had 65 electrical devices connected at any given time, and idle, always-on consumption across those homes averaged 164 watts. Roughly the equivalent of brewing 234 cups of coffee every single day without a single cup ever poured. In percentage terms, that always-on drain accounted for close to 23% of total household electricity use in the homes studied. NRDC then extrapolated that regional finding across the country and estimated the national cost at around $19 billion a year, about $165 per household on average, climbing toward $440 annually for homes on higher-tier electricity pricing. So why does hardly anyone know this? It isn't a conspiracy. It's simpler and honestly more boring than that. Utility companies sell electricity by the kilowatt hour, and idle load is guaranteed, predictable demand that requires zero marketing effort to sustain. There's no incentive built into that business model to tell you to unplug things. On the manufacturing side, for decades, the competitive pressure among electronics companies was about speed, how fast a TV powers on, how instantly a cable box responds, not about how little power a device sips while doing nothing. Standby drain was treated as a rounding error in product design meetings, and that rounding error got passed straight to your electricity bill without anyone flagging it. Governments did eventually respond, just quietly. In 1999, the International Energy Agency launched what's known as the 1 Watt Initiative, pushing manufacturers worldwide to cap standby consumption at 1 watt per device. Japan adopted it early, Korea and Australia followed, and in 2001, the US government required federal agencies to purchase only devices meeting that 1 watt standard. The European Union turned it into binding regulation by 2010. These weren't fringe policy moves. They came from the same international body that coordinates energy policy for the world's largest economies. The problem was real enough to trigger global regulation. It just never got translated into a plain language warning on your utility bill. Now, here's the genuinely useful part. What NRDC's own researchers calculated as the payoff. If every U.S. household simply reduced its idle load to match what the most energy-conscious quarter of homes in their study had already achieved, no new technology, no solar panels, no smart devices required, the country would save around $8 billion a year in utility bills, avoid 64 billion kilowatt hours of wasted electricity, and cut about 44 million metric tons of carbon emissions. That's not a hypothetical future scenario. That's the gap between an average home and a slightly more attentive one. So how do you actually close that gap tonight for $0 at Hidden Fix lab-style simplicity? Start with your entertainment cluster: TV, cable or streaming box, soundbar, game console. These almost never need to be individually unplugged. Instead, run them all through one switched power strip, the kind with a rocker switch on the side, available for $10 to $15 anywhere. One flip at night kills the entire cluster's draw in one motion. Do the same in any bedroom with a television, especially guest rooms, which the NRDC audits flagged as some of the worst offenders simply because they sit idle for weeks between use. In a home office, group your monitor, printer, and external drives onto a second switched strip. Just leave your router on its own outlet since that one genuinely needs to stay connected. In the kitchen, appliances with digital clocks, coffee makers, microwaves, toaster ovens don't need to stay lit between uses. And if you have an older second refrigerator or chest freezer sitting in a garage rarely opened, that's frequently one of the single biggest idle load culprits in a house, sometimes costing over $100 a year on its own. None of this requires an electrician, an app, or a subscription. It requires walking room to room once, deciding what's genuinely being used versus what's just sitting there listening for a signal that might come eventually, and putting a switch between it and the wall. The Department of Energy said it plainly back in 2008. Phantom loads can be avoided by unplugging devices or using a power strip with its switch. 12 words. Free. Not particularly exciting to say out loud, which is probably part of why it never became a headline, but that's really the point worth sitting with. The biggest wastes aren't always hidden behind expensive fixes or complicated technology. Sometimes they're sitting in plain sight, quietly normalized for so long that nobody thinks to question them. The science on this has existed since the 90s. The instructions have existed since 2008. What's been missing isn't the information. It's someone actually walking you through your own house and pointing at the outlets. That's it. That's the whole fix.